It's go time.
Hey everyone, if you tuned in and you're expecting to see Sean Murphy, you can see him, but tonight I'm sitting in his hot seat as you were. Welcome to the 1455 author series. And tonight I get to turn the chair on Sean Murphy, who's usually hosting these episodes with authors. But he asked me if I would sit where he usually sits and grill him the way I'm kidding about the grilling, but talk with him about his new book the way that he has talked to so many authors. And so it's my great honor to be able to do that. Sean, I thank you for inviting me to do that. And I look forward to the next hour with you talking about your new book. Sean Murphy is, as many of you know, the 1455's founder and director. In addition to supporting and promoting so many authors, is a darn good writer himself. Sean has published a memoir, Please Talk About Me When I'm Gone, a novel, Not to Mention a Nice Life, 2 collections of essays, Murphy's Law, volumes 1 and 2. And now, tonight, he's bringing out, I mean, you're completing like the trifecta, more than the trifecta, to discuss and to read from this wonderful book of poems, his first collection of poems, published poems, called The Blackened Blues. So welcome, Sean. My privilege to speak with you and to hear you read from this book tonight. Welcome to the 1455 author series.
It's great to be welcomed to the series. And Justin, it's, as always, is obviously a pleasure. Can never get enough talking to you about life and literature and all that good stuff. But it's very meaningful to me to talk to you in particular, and I'll explain why in a second. But without further ado, let me also shout out to our partners at DC's historic Potter's House. I'm going to read a little bit about their mission. We partner with them on all of our author series events, and they make all of the books that are for our series available through bookshop.org. So please visit Potter's House and support independent bookstores. The Potter's House is a nonprofit cafe, bookstore, and event space in the Adams Morgan neighborhood of Washington, D.C. And since opening the doors in 1960, they've been a key place for deeper conversations, creative expression, and community transformation. We've enjoyed doing the virtual things with them because the show must go on. But 1455 is really looking forward to getting back in person and doing a whole bunch more live events at their space. So we always appreciate them and their support. And I'm going to introduce the interviewer. Those of you that are familiar with 1455 know Justin because he's deeply involved both as a board member and a writer whose work we're always trying to discuss and hear about. But briefly, Justin has served as Martha's Vineyard's Poet Laureate. He's the author of 2 collections of poems, A Strange Catechism and A Machine for Remembering, both of which are brilliant and highly recommended. And he is the founder and directed the Noepe Center for Literary Arts at Martha's Vineyard for over a decade. A masterpiece of community and vision. And one of the primary reasons, aside from the fact that he's a dear friend and a brilliant poet, I started writing many of the poems that originated in this collection were written at Noepe in the summer of 2016 when I served as the writer in residence, and Justin and I spent an entire season up there running the place and really getting to know each other. So Justin has a deep connection to this work, and the work has a deep connection to him. So on a personal level, it's really meaningful to talk to you tonight, Justin, because you've been part of the whole process here from start to finish.
Hey, thank you, Sean. It's funny you should mention that because I can remember you texting me or calling me, or I would drop by because, as Sean mentioned, he was running the show at Noepe, and I would pop in and make sure everything was going smoothly, which it always was. And he would say, I wrote a poem today, like all excited. I wrote a whole poem today, or I got a whole poem today. And so I didn't realize, I'm sure you didn't either, that those were going to end up in this collection together, or some of them. So actually, that kind of dovetails nicely into my first question, which is first thing I wanted to talk about is all of the poems in this book um, are about, uh, and we can get into how they're constructed a little bit later as we go along, but they're about, for the most part, celebrities, musicians, especially jazz musicians, um, poets, um, celebrities, some infamous people, but all people that we would know in our pop culture, but some lesser well known. But I wanted to, I guess this is my first question is, um, how did this idea come? When did you know it was kind of turning into these poems about people? They're more than about people, but
Yeah.
you get what I'm saying. So how did this idea come, and what? Yeah, how did this idea come?
It's appropriate, and it's a question I'm happy to answer to kick things off. You know, so the short answer really is that, you know, the topics and subject of this collection grows out of some obsessions of mine. You know, I've written a decent amount of fiction, and I continue to write nonfiction, but I was really doing a great deal of music, movie, and book criticism, mostly through, you know, the first decade and a half of the new century. And I was also writing about politics a lot, and I still do that stuff. But what there was something about writing reviews, and even especially writing about politics, you know, which was, uh, they were personal obsessions. You know, anyone that knows me knows I'm a music freak. Um, but there was something evanescent and ultimately unsatisfying about even the most passionately researched and written review. I feel really happy doing that work because it stays written and it can be referenced. And every now and then I'll go on Wikipedia, look something up, and I'll see a music review I wrote being referenced. So it's like, that's wonderful that work lives. But there was something I felt, you know, no matter how well written, it's only going to reach a certain audience. And the people that I'm potentially turning on to this musician or this music or this movie, this issue, it's a very limited audience. Where in the literary world, it's the exact opposite. You might be getting some cross current and actually doing some introductions. And so it was very organic, Justin, but I started thinking about ways to take a particular musician or a particular situation and attack it poetically. And I kind of made it up as I went along. But what I found satisfying was it could take a topic that would be fodder for a complete review or appraisal or essay and really condense it down. And it became kind of a challenge to, how do you capture a life and bring in the autobiographical elements and the you know, what I loved about grad school, kind of the cultural studies like approach that takes in, you know, biography and politics and history and socio-political aspects, and position it in a way that it's a very contemporary look at a person or situation that warrants kind of a deeper dialogue. And so once I started doing that, I found that I had all this repository of knowledge and passion that I had never found an outlet for. Because frankly, right, who cares that I love Billie Holiday or Charles Mingus? You know, if I'm not going to write about a particular album, what do you do with that? I don't feel comfortable, or I didn't want to attack it through fiction. I don't think I could convincingly render these topics in that way. I don't think it would really serve that body of work. But through poetry, it seemed like an original way that it's satisfying to me aesthetically, because for better or worse, if the poems fail or succeed, you know, is in the eye of the beholder, but they're definitely original takes on a particular topic. So I feel like I've cultivated a certain style, and it's a neat strategy for getting inside some of these lives.
Huh. Wow, you answered so many questions I was going to follow up with. How does the genre, how does poetry as a form, what does it do that the essay form didn't allow you to do? And one of the things that I find, and I'm going to answer this partly, and then you can chime in, is that there is an intimacy that I think you've created in these poems, and so you're giving all of this, a lot of there's a lot of biographical information in these poems, but um, they don't feel as just kind of rote facts about someone's life the way you would read in a biographical entry. You've managed, I think, very successfully, and I think it's what makes this book and these poems really why they're really strong and why they really resonate. There's a way that you're inside with these poems, in a way that they feel intimate. They feel like the speaker. It's different than someone writing an essay about a critical work. So if you could talk about poetry and maybe some of what this form allows you to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. So to be certain, right? Criticism, again, I mean, anyone that knows my work or goes to my website, like I wrote a lot, and I continue to do. In fact, props to the late great Lee Scratch Perry, who left this sphere of consciousness the other day, but he's still very much with us and always will be. Taking a reappraisal of a classic album or a current album, or writing an essay about a book, or writing a political essay, which I've done a lot of, and I've tried to do it well, and it is very satisfying. It requires a certain skill set, certain ability, a lot of patience and research, but there is something you almost have to be. It's not that you have to be objective, but there are certain parameters. Like you shouldn't necessarily infuse a personal feeling in an appraisal of a classic album. It's just not appropriate to the form.
Right.
What I love about using a poem, it's not that dissimilar from fiction in that all the bets are off. You can use a lot of different tactics to try to get inside the mind, or you can render judgments with one line or one anecdote that would require a buildup and an understanding of that person you're talking about. So again, if you're talking about, one of the poems deals with Bud Powell, and he was viciously assaulted by a police officer with a nightstick, and it impacted the rest of his life. To write an essay about that, which I'm sure there have been plenty of brilliant essays written about that, it would require, all right, let me set the tone, and let me give you the background, and let me tell you who this person is. With a poem, you can get right into it. And I think what's neat about that is I don't assume that someone necessarily knows who some of these people are. So it obliges the reader then to maybe go read a little autobiographical or biographical information, and then maybe they can revisit, and then the poem can continue to resonate as the person maybe explores the music or explores the life story, or is able to make a connection and say, why are you talking about a police beating that happened in the 1950s? Well, because that's still very relevant, and unfortunately very much a part of our contemporary, climate. So what I find neat about it is in a way, there are no rules. And so in some ways that's very liberating, but in some ways, right, as as a brilliant poet, it also sets its own parameters. You can't get away with anything. Ideally, it's got to be a page or two, give or take. And so you're obliged as the creator to try to render this judgment or this observation or this meditation as succinctly as possible, but also do it in a way that brings an originality and makes people see familiar things in a new way.
Well, you certainly do all of those things in these poems, and what I've marveled at is you have introduced me to especially if we can focus for a minute, and then maybe you'll read a poem
Sure.
about with the jazz artists. I like jazz music, but I'm not deep into it. But reading this book has definitely awakened in me wanting to explore the genre of jazz and the people, the men and women who have created the music. And that's really a credit to the poems, because never do I read these poems without getting so much information, and you deliver it in a way that I'm curious. And I think part of how you do this and why it feels it's successful to me is I know that I can feel your love and admiration for these artists. So Again, I think it covers the whole book, although there are some exceptions. I mean, there's definitely one people that you are not loving. And that's
Right.
great too. But if I'm focusing just on the jazz artists,
Yeah.
your love and admiration for these artists and their genius, what they've created and the gifts that they've left you and how it's touched your life, that's palpable. It comes through in those poems. And so, yeah, there's a real intimacy. And I think someone who has not felt the things that you uh, are writing about, they couldn't have written these poems. They would be very superficial. And these poems are not, they're moving. And so maybe you could read a poem, if I could point you to just, some about one of the jazz musicians, because I've heard you read from this collection live as well in person. I know that you often give wonderful background biographical notes. So including that as a segue for all of our listeners too, that'd be
Sure.
great. Great.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so yeah, you pretty much teed it up nicely. For me, Justin, one of the things, the impetus behind some of this work does precede a lot of the serious writing I did. I mean, I can think back to being in my, I went down a rabbit hole. I was a music obsessive as far back as I can remember. And so that tracked all through high school and college, but late in college, by chance, I already kind of knew jazz a little bit and I knew I liked it, but it was just such an intimidating genre. I had an elective to burn and I took a class called Introduction to Jazz Music. And I thought, what a wonderful opportunity. And it was it was a life-changing, it was a specific class that went decade by decade through the 20th century. So it helped give me, some training wheels in terms of, the different genres and eras. And I quickly honed in on bebop and post bop. So mid 50s through the late 60s was the sweet spot that I really honed in on. And this music changed my life. It became, a real genuine inspiration and obsession. And the more I learned and read, there were some common themes that emerged. One of which was, in a world that even in the 90s, was becoming increasingly cynical and commodified and commercialized, and we're seeing reality TV. There's something so refreshing about just on a basic level to improvise jazz music. You can't not be good at your instrument. There are posers out there, but I mean, to be a professional jazz musician requires those 20,000 hours and change of dedication and practice. So there's a seriousness to it and a joy in it and a brilliance in it. No one sets out to be a jazz musician to become rich. So it's cynicism proof. But then the other side of that coin is a great deal of these musicians happen to be Black. And we're living through an era, few people would argue that that's not still a significant challenge in 2021, which is appalling and topic for many, many other discussions. But when I think about, among many other things, the fact that many of these men and women were living in a society that actively worked against them. So you and I think anyone that loves literature and art can talk about, well, that's the artistic way, right? Directors and producers and actors and writers have often been stymied by having to make a living and navigating that world. But to think that these people were making this transcendent, inspirational music in a world that actively sought to harm them and suppress them, to me, starts to become miraculous. So there's a real passion and a real kind of anger for me of how badly they were treated and the gifts that they gave humanity. So this collection and the other poems I'm writing, for this project are really a genuine way of trying, in a very modest and humble way, to bear witness and celebrate their lives, but also indict the world we live in, for trying to hold them back. And maybe that's an okay segue to one poem, probably one of my all-time heroes, in life. So certainly artistically, creatively, on a human level. But Charles Mingus, who is now recognized and was not unrecognized at the time, But he's generally recognized as a significant musician in the 20th century. It's an assessment I certainly agree with. I've written a lot about him and his work. I've listened to his work obsessively and with great joy. It still continues to astonish and delight me. But here's a guy who had to form his own record label because he couldn't find, I mean, we're not talking about making a living. The record labels were not interested in the work he was doing, the work that's now generally recognized as brilliant. And he was an outspoken Black man living in New York City, routinely hassled, always scrambling to put together bands. And just through the sheer force of will, he made the world recognize. He made music that was impossible to be ignored. But in the single year of 1957, he made 7 albums. Wildly different in style. They all sound completely different, but they're all locked in. They're all at the highest level of the form. And in his autobiography, Beneath the Underdog, which itself is just a work of art, the title is a work of art. But he talks about in 1957 saying, it's almost my time. He knew. He felt this wave coming on that took him through the next decade. But I wrote a poem called Charles Mingus's Miracle that specifically focuses on that year. And I think those of you that haven't heard any of these or don't know who I am, this will at least give you a flavor for what I'm trying to achieve, because it's all in here. Trying to take in the biographical element, but and talk about the ridiculousness of the world he lived in and fought against and transcended, but also just a celebration of this unbelievable genius's life force. So this is called Charles Mingus's Miracle. The thing about Charlie Mingus Jr., who clattered onto the scene like a grand piano in a punch bowl, is that he also was young once. More than that, fate made him endure indignities that make a street bum look like Reagan's strapping young buck on food stamps, savoring a T-bone. Systems so sullied, even mobsters did more than movie critics, but that's entertainment. I'm Black, therefore I'm not. This is what 400 years of errors and trials, faith wrung out of unripened rinds, forced folks with the nerve to be born neither wealthy nor white to know from the get-go. And for the love of a stained glass God, don't speak off script or they'll wash the mutiny from your mouth with a fire hose. That's why most men lie down mutely in darkness, safe or at least sheltered beneath the underdog of hatred and history. Get them to kill each other, or better yet, hoodwink them into hating themselves. That's the anti-American dream too many citizens sleep through, fed a fixed diet of indifference, intolerance, and interference. So what can you do if you know you're a genius and all the Klan's men can never convince you that water isn't wet? Keep rolling that rock up the hill until it grinds a fresh groove into the earth. Improvise your own force majeure. This is almost my time, he said, and good God, wasn't he more than half right? I know one thing, you can quote him. I'm not going to let anyone change me. Overflowing with awareness of himself, fresh out of the furnace, molded in the image of a bird that flew first and further, mapping out the contours of this new language, dialogic, indomitable, his work exploded, a defiant weed cutting through concrete. 1957, 5 albums in 12 months, righteous waves quenching a coastline, reconfiguring the world the way nature does. And his reward? A brief stretch in Bellevue. Ain't that a bitch? Listen, When Duke Ellington declared music his mistress, he was lucky enough to need nobody, aware that the genetic razor cleaving obsession and insanity is capricious, like all those calamities that Poseidon orchestrated. Mingus was never not human. The impossible endowment that drove him destroyed him, and in death restored him. His tenacity was the heat that both healed and hurt. A comet cursed with consciousness. He went harder, dug deeper, even as his best work impended, yet unrealized revelations. Blues and roots, the brown man's burden, a thorny crown worn only by dispossessed prophets willing or able to testify. His recalcitrant wisdom earned the way trees acquire rings. The reality of who he was, even if he too changed at times, like the country that claimed him, mostly after the fact. And whether you're committed, an exiled crusader, or a respectable suit working to death in squared circles, the message from that rare bird song still resound today. An epiphany blown through the slipstream. Now's the time. So yeah, that's Charles Mingus.
Wow. Was he ever recognized in his, did he get recognition in his, while he was still alive?
He did, but it was always tough for him.
Yeah.
You know, it sounds almost trite to say this, but when we say money was difficult, I mean, he had to deal with potential homelessness, being kicked out of his apartment in New York City several times, trying to keep a band together, you know, having bandmates that were strung out, which is, again, a whole other side discussion in terms of, you know, the lifestyle and what people were driven to because of, you know, not being able to make ends meet. So he was recognized, Justin, but never at the level he should have been, and certainly never got the institutional support that he so desperately could have used.
Well, you mentioned some of the things that go along, and again, these poems are not sentimental, as you could, you know, those of you who are listening to this poem. And by the way, when you read this at Featherstone Center for the Arts here on Martha's Vineyard, when you gave your reading over the summer, I remember this poem got a tremendous response from the audience, and people even came up to you after and were in conversation with you about this poem and the other and many other poems, because these aren't sentimental pictures. I mean, I feel like the poems are, in some ways, they're elegies. They, you know, they really just the affection for the people that they're about, but they're never didactic. You don't pull your punches, though, but I never feel like you're lecturing either. There's just there's a wonderful way that, again, I think it's just it's something to do with your intimacy, I think, with the lives and with the art of these the people that you're writing about, that allows you to write in this way. I don't know how else to say it, but one thing you were mentioning about, so some of these people in all of these poems, the reason I was bringing up they're not sentimental is because you do talk about addictions. There are poems where of mental illness. There's you know, there are other things that go hand in hand, perhaps, and this is kind of where I want to go with this, is with genius, with being not just born in a society that's rejecting you and oppressing you, but then there's the other element that of being so exceptional, perhaps, that you're really out of time.
Yeah.
Meaning, you know, you're beyond the time, and what you're doing, just we're not ready for it. And so I wonder if you could speak to that too, and if that at all informed who you chose to write about.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, I think, again, this project makes so much sense to me because, you know, and I say this when I tell people about it, right, and you appreciate this, you know, there's no false modesty. It's like, you're gonna write poetry, that's probably not coming from a place of cynicism. You're gonna write poetry about jazz musicians, you're definitely not trying to put your finger up and go, what's gonna resonate, you know, commercially, or so. I don't have a chip on my shoulder. I don't feel like I have any extra street cred because I'm writing poetry about, you know, known and lesser known jazz musicians, but there's certainly an authenticity that I think comes through. And again, it's usually coming from a place of celebration or indignation, or maybe a little bit of both. And it for me, what's really good is the reservoir is pretty deep. So you start talking about, what the 20th century, not to mention the 21st century, but what the 20th century did to American genius, cutting across blues and jazz in particular, how badly we treated these people that we now put on postage stamps. And we should put them on postage stamps. But boy, that approbation would have gone a long way when they were struggling to live. There for me, there's literally, I guess there's not literally a limitless amount of source material, but it's a deep well, and it's a well that, it's almost like, speaking of lack of cynicism, I've spent 40 years of my life obsessively acquiring and listening to music. So the potential for subject matter is very deep, and that's gratifying, because I think it's a story that needs to be told. And where I envision this project going is, at the end, whether it's this collection or several more volumes, you're getting a kind of a cross section of American world culture, primarily American culture, and a desire to kind of interrogate and deconstruct and celebrate. But I'd love to read a shorter poem that talks about what you were just talking about. It's called Richard Pryors' Flesh. And, the story here, right? Well, so Richard Pryor, even at the time, was generally regarded as the alpha male of comedy.
What time are we talking? Where are we?
So Richard Pryor, from the late 60s probably through the late 80s, kind of ruled. But by the late 70s, 78, 79, 80, 81, I mean, he was, the king. And he, for my money, to this day, what I consider the best hour of stand-up ever is Richard Pryor in concert from 1979 in California, because it wants a genius at the height of their powers, but it also anticipates what ended up happening, because he talks about his issues with the law, his issues with women, his issues with cocaine and freebasing. And he'd already had a heart attack, I think in his early 30s, living a hard life, but he was putting himself out on that edge, and just, I think, had a hard time. You're that brilliant, it's got to be difficult to live a normal life. But what ended up happening with him, which he brilliantly talked about in Richard Pryor on the Sunset Strip in 1982, was his incident where he blew himself up. At the time, it was reported as an accident. He later talked about it as a half-assed suicide attempt. But basically, he'd gotten so deep into his freebasing habit, I think the despair and the rush of feelings, and who knows what else accompanies that, he poured rum on himself and lit himself on fire, and was running down the road on fire, and subsequently, went into the hospital, and they saved him, but his body was burned. Wow. So that became, I think I've written about how I think that's like a generational incident that defines the thin line between genius and madness, and the pressures of society, and not to take anyone off the hook, right? Like self-imposed addiction and damage, but Richard Pryor certainly contained multitudes, and that incident was kind of the ugly side of the glory of his stand-up routine. So I wanted to kind of get a handle on that. So the poem's entitled Richard Pryor's Flesh. And I used some biblical quotes for context. Take, eat. This is my body, which is broken for you. How many times did we hear that back in the day? This cup is the new covenant of my blood. In remembrance of who? And which way is up? The light shines in the darkness. Do you see the light? And the darkness has not overcome it. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. The church was our school and vice versa. Both things we outgrew as we grew out of everything they beat into us. So many switches swinging in the winter wind, breaking our backs because this hurts you more than it does me. Thy will be done. Cast them into the furnace of fire. Now we're talking. Every man who tells the truth has to take the heat, face it, eat it, bathe in it, and pour lighter fluid on the flames. This is just what a genius does. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering. You see, the gods demand abnegation, their alms. Mere mortals can put cash in the basket, but certain sorts of men pay in a different way. The kind of currency that leaves singed skin and scars. That's the price of admission. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. How? Bodies are only boats surrounded by the spirits. Why? If you have to ask, you'll never know. Prove you mean it. That means you're real. This life only hurts because you're alive.
Wow. Yeah, that kind of hurt being alive, and this kind of suffering that goes with really really being at the edge, on the edge, as you mentioned, of that, walking that line between genius and maybe madness. It pervades the book, and yeah, I mean, you capture it so well in that poem, but you also do it so well in others. We've had discussions a little bit about that. It's like, I wonder if some of these people realize the genius of what they were creating when they were creating it. I think we had this conversation last time I saw you a little bit, like, to what degree do you even recognize it? Or are you just doing what you do? I know it's not really a question, but there is that.
Yeah, I think, so like, I think Mingus knew he was a genius, and that caused him more pain, right? Because, and I address this a little bit in the poem, what do you do if you're a genius and the world shrugs their shoulders? Well, you give up, put a gun in your mouth, or you just keep doing it, and have that faith. So that's when I say, like, their music inspires me, but their lives inspire me as well. Where with Richard Pryor, he was famous and wealthy, and he deserved to be, but the fact that he was in a great deal of pain and made other people, he found a way to channel that into not just humor, because there's been plenty of humor, but the concerts I mentioned, especially the live in concert, there's so much observation of life and relationships. He gave such a gift to the world by taking his pain and spinning gold out of it. There's something very heroic about that. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's a martyr type thing, but artistically it kind of is. And any artist that can channel those impulses into something positive, to me, is a heroic act. But we've talked a little bit about the darkness. If you'll indulge me, there's also a lot of celebration, and I think kind of the antithesis of some of what we're talking about, just the pure pursuit of kind of expression and self-actualization. There's a genius named Sonny Rollins, who's still with us. I want to say he's 92. But Sonny, along with John Coltrane, was recognized as being, the preeminent sax player of his generation. And a lot of the younger whippersnappers were kind of nipping at his heels in the late 50s. And there's a true story that I want to make sure I actually get the year right, because for some reason I'm doubting. Yeah, it was 59, which for my money is the best year of music in all history. In 1959, actually, I'll read what I write in the book, because I rather than go long-winded. In 1959, feeling pressured by his unexpected rise to fame, Sonny Rollins took a 3-year hiatus to focus on perfecting his craft. A resident of the Lower East Side, New York City, with no private space to play, he took his saxophone up to the Williamsburg Bridge to practice alone. So Sonny, at the height of his fame, and generally recognized as the best in the business, felt that other people were pushing the boundaries further. So he walked away from the money, walked away from fame, and worked on his craft. To me, there was something very monk-like about that. So I wrote a poem really trying to pay witness to that level of dedication and honesty. And it's called Sonny Rollins' Bridge. It wasn't his bridge, of course. It wasn't even his city. And it certainly wasn't his world. It's your world, jazz music says. I'm just living in it. And the world's a workshop. Sonny was different, though. Even for one we call young, gifted, and Black without being bromidic. Sonny heard so much, but mostly only listened to himself, waiting and creating his own kind of way, expressing everything. How do we describe the kind of man already in rarefied air, deciding he wasn't high enough, having already eschewed the artificial ecstasy that ruins veins and soils brains, body, and soul? This colossus, keeping his own counsel, split his apartment to set up ship in the crow's nest of the Williamsburg Bridge, perhaps the one place aside from the Arctic Circle where no one could hear or see history being picked apart like a carcass and then reassembled in real time. 3 years of this, almost 1,000 days, while the world spun, the cash registers rung, and so many pretenders to the throne ascended for lack of better options. Sun turned to snow and dawn turned to dark, and there were still all those sounds, a style being tweaked, a gift being refined, an experiment being improvised. The quest for vision, it said, will make otherwise steady men see outlandish sights. As they deprive themselves of human fuel, they become something at once less and more than a vessel. The spirits speak to and through them, and once that barrier is broken, one sees oneself changed and then begins to change the world.
That's an amazing poem.
Thank you.
Wow.
Yeah,
I think that might be one of my favorites. It's hard to say, but I think it's one of my favorites. Were you going to say something and then I'll have a comment? But
no, please.
Well, I think the two of us are both attracted to that in other artists, and that those persons who are willing to walk, not necessarily away, but who know what it takes to kind of to go in to get to that work that they need to make, right? And in this case with Sonny Rollins, he retreats from the world for 3 years. That idea to me, and I know it appeals to you too, of like, I can see him up on that bridge or in the Arctic, which is the other place you said he could go where nobody would be able to hear it. Yeah. But that retreating to oneself and there making without audience, without feedback, without, the pressures of making money or commercialism or commodification, you're crystallizing what is your art. So anyway, if you would speak to that, because I know we share that attraction.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Justin. And the other part, because you got to be succinct in the explanation. I mean, Sonny is, if anyone looks him up or looks at interviews, I mean, he is the most gentle, soul. But one of the reasons he retreated from his apartment is because he didn't want to keep his neighbors up. Like even that impulse grew out of a very generous, polite impulse to not be up at all hours. So there was nothing self-aggrandizing or pretentious about his act. But yeah, I mean, I think to me, that poem and Sonny's life is kind of the antidote to, so many of the cliches, especially as it relates to like jazz and blues. Like, well, you had to be a heroin addict, or you had to be an alcoholic, or, you had to be poor in order to channel the muse, or, any of the number of things, which invariably are also kind of racist and certainly prejudiced. because it reduces people to types instead of being very complicated, very brilliant individuals. But to me, aside from all that, Sonny is such a role model for any creative or any human being, really finding. So there's an element of monk-like dedication. There's an element of self-denial. There's an element of sacrifice. There's an element of passion, but also an element of the real self-acknowledgement. There's a man that knows who he is, and I think his gift, he's just tried to refine that, and he's humbled by his ability, therefore he tries even harder. I find that endlessly inspiring, and again, I find that a human antidote to a lot of the despair, a lot of the struggle that we see in these pages. Sonny just kind of transcended a lot of the worldly concerns, and I very deliberately kind of used that kind of Native American, the vision quest. I think he went on a vision quest, a very real vision quest, and came out the other side, and that stood him well in subsequent decades. That was the early 1960s, and he's still with us.
Well, and these things you can't justify in our market economy, how what you find when you go in and make these things, or what you gain from such a devotion of this time to yourself and to your art and to your in his case his making music. But it could be, and you mentioned this is such a great example for other artists, and since we're on a platform for writers, and this is dear to me as well, that devotion, the dividends that we pay ourselves the dividends that are paid to us when we really sink into our work. I mean this when I say it. The payoff for that is far greater than any monies, awards that we could possibly get, because those things are fleeting. But what's the last line of this poem? I think it kind of nails it, or almost the last line. Let me see if I can grab it real quick. Yeah, one changed. One sees oneself changed, then begins changing the world. That kind of necessary work that has to happen inside. The gift of that to oneself is there's no amount of money that could ever that could replicate that.
Yeah, I mean, amen, Justin. And I think, I always approach that topic with a genuine modesty, because what a lot of people don't understand, or people that are in the game understand, is, it's fraught with rejection. There's very little fame or fortune. And so those of us that have kept doing it decade after decade, despite the odds, or despite the rewards, in a commercial sense, if you're not doing it, from some deep impulse, I think you're always going to be scratching an itch that can't be itched, and you're chasing something that can't be caught. Because as we see with someone like Richard Pryor, or probably any number of pop star icons, you can transcend and get the money and the fame and the fortune, but you're still going to be unhappy. So it's a refuge that the unacknowledged writers amongst us take, but it is also very genuine. So I would say, jokingly, I would sardonically say, well, we better cling to that, because we're certainly not, going on our worldwide book tours. But I, of course, agree with you completely that if you're not doing what you do in life, and it's certainly in the arts, but I think in any endeavor, if you're not in a relationship or friendships or career paths that bring you some kind of gratification, or coming from an organic, authentic place, you're going to always be unsatisfied, and you're going to turn to things like booze and drugs and, social media or whatever. And you're probably going to continue to be disappointed.
Well, I love that poem. I'm glad that you read that, and I got to hear it in addition to reading it, because it gives me such a deeper appreciation for not just your work and the craft that goes into that, but now, Sonny Rollins, I want to know more about him. So I will definitely check that out. Are there any other poems you'd like to share, Sean, or do you have one more?
Yeah, so there's one, so this is great, right, Justin? And this borders on sentimental, but it really isn't. This is very authentic, but this is one of the first poems I wrote at Noepe. So yes, and I genuinely didn't think about that when I thought about reading this tonight, but this ties together a few threads because it speaks directly about a poet and poetry and someone that lived on a pretty fine line between gratification and obscurity and personal destruction, Charles Bukowski. And he's a tricky one, right? Because I think people in the literary community, I mean, he's very out of fashion. And in some regards, he should be, because it's kind of like the Hemingway and the, any number of like the belligerent, like, I get drunk and I get in fights and that leads to the experience. With Bukowski, that was all kind of incidental. Like he drank too much and did get into fights, but it wasn't, like Hunter Thompson became a bit of a caricature. Bukowski was always putting in the work, and the work was much more important to him. But the deeper I've read of his work, I'll just put it this way, because again, this could be a whole other topic for conversation. I find more purity and truth and humanity in any number of Bukowski's poems than I do from so much contemporary poetry that's lionized and anthologized. He wrote a lot of poetry, and not all of it's great. Some of it isn't even very good. But man, when he got hold of one, it went a long way. But what I loved about Bukowski was, and this is true of Hemingway to a certain extent, at least at a certain point in his career, there's an old school kind of authenticity and integrity of getting the work done. So I think with someone like Bukowski, that did become fodder. He did do things and set patterns that he believed in, like putting on classical music and drinking red wine would make the muse flow. Well, I'm sure there were some days that didn't happen, but one of the things that he did and he wrote about was going to the horse races. And that became, I think for me anyway, a metaphor for kind of the yin yang of distractions and addictions, but also things that feed the life. Like here was a guy that wasn't trying to get in the academic world, or he never moved to New York City to go to the right parties. He lived in a shady part of LA and went to the horse races every day. So anyway, and his alter ego in some of his fiction is Henry Chinaski. So this is Henry Chinaski's Horses. He couldn't face the words, he wrote, until he made it back from the track. For a man famous for his refusal to use metaphors, telling it straight like a tire iron, this one kind of crept up on him, like they do. Sort of the way the so-called real world punches suckers. But perhaps that's still too affected by half, since the only thing we know worse than too little truth is too much of the same old shit. Anyhow, Hank had his horses and his handicaps, like all of us, no matter what we tell ourselves. Whether it's humping a desk or hustling the morning line, or finding other ways to avoid assenting to work altogether, we all need patterns and schemes. Because by regulating our routines, they free up aspects of ourselves that are otherwise engaged, like our dreams and imaginations. Or else we're out of time, out of our minds. So Hank had his horses, and they told him who he was on any given day. A winner, a loser, a player. And blinkered or busted or flush, he returned to his humble post position and that typewriter, waiting for him and placing its own bets. Was the master in form, pulling up lane, wielding his whip? Could he coax them through the muck, past the front of the pack, ending with that ultimate trifecta, booze, women, and words? And then pause for the money shot, parading past the winner's circle. You see, success is a salve that quenches a cultivated kind of thirst. And what matters, finally, isn't how you walk through the fire, but the resolve to put your feet forward in the first place, urging all those ideas to sneak up like solved secrets, reminders that even long shots need somewhere to go, some way to live.
Wow. Thank you. Huh. And I guess in a way, it's a good place to end on that line, because in a real way, almost everyone in this collection is a long shot that needed some place to go, and art was that place, or music or writing was the way that they could find themselves a winner some days, a loser some days, as you write, or flush,
Yep.
even flush. Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes it's fun to, to play with metaphor, play with cliche, and own it, and then dive in and try to find ways to wrap around like the creative process, or what drives people, or what separates lasting art from, schlock. And I think you're right. The long shots and underdogs, and certainly for me, really the motivation, or one of the primary motivation that I think infuses all of these poems is a real appreciation for the underdog. And it's not a stance or a calculated resistance to like what we would call normal society. But for me anyway, the only thing that matters to me is the art authentic? Is it honest? Is it coming from a real place? Is it original? Is it trying to be original? And everyone that's celebrated in this piece is lauded for trying to, despite whatever the obstacles were, carve out their own place. And of course, it's not too many steps, too many exits down that path to applying that to all of us in all of our endeavors. And to me, part of also my own writing is trying to find ways to resist easy thought and groupthink and things that are just calculated by cynicism. I've used that word a lot, but for me, there's so much cynicism and a cynical use of irony, in our discourse. So if anyone, no matter what they're doing, just trying to be the most authentic version of themselves is a way of getting back at the system. I think the system wants us to be apathetic and wants us to conform, wants us to spend money and chase that dragon of satisfaction that's never going to yield results. And Justin, to bring it full circle, as I always relish having the opportunity to do, you were a very big positive force of inspiration for me by refusing to wait or need someone else's validation. You created a community at Noepe that provided time and space and community, and that type of vision, that type of refusal to wait one's turn or wait till there's a certain approval from certain self-appointed forces, you just created a whole new reality, and it pulled people into that reality and changed their lives, myself very much included. And I don't think that this book of poetry exists without my stay at Noepe. So there's a real debt of gratitude that I owe you for that inspiration and giving me perhaps that space I needed to start thinking deeply on how some of these threads could be tied together. And it's the gift that keeps giving, both in terms of my creative pursuits, but also our wonderful relationship.
Oh, well, thank you, Sean, again. And I could echo that. Like, in a lot of ways, I grew up with Noepe. I grew up by doing Noepe and learning and having all the writers who came to Noepe kind of validating, the vision that I had. But without yourself and other writers who came, I wouldn't have been able to do what I did. So it was such a rest. It was really one of the first things that I did in my life where the reciprocity, it just, the more I put into it and felt like I was, others were getting a gift. I didn't feel like, but others were telling me what a gift. I felt like I was getting a gift. It was quite an amazing, and it continues. 1455 is a direct, direct lineage to Noepe, as you've mentioned many times, and the community, some of whom I'm sure the people from Noepe are on, listening to us right now. Always in my heart, all of that, those people in that community. So,
Yeah.
Sean, yeah. I don't know if you have a hard fast like time, but I don't know.
That feels good. I mean,
Okay.
I think that the one thing we can always promise to each other, if nothing else, is our conversations will continue. So that's a very liberating. I don't feel the need to squeeze anything else in.
Okay.
Also,
I'm gonna
leave them
go ahead.
wanting more.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna see you on Sunday, so we'll continue this conversation.
For sure.
Brilliant.
I'll just close by saying, I went up to Noepe in March of 2016 with a couple of milk crates full of notes for a novel, and left with a bunch of poems. So there's a story. Somebody write a book about that. But no, that story continues, and I'm just so grateful. So again, thanks to our pals at Potter's House. Check out the work they're doing, support them. Check us out at 1455litarts.org. You can get involved, you can support us, you can work with us, you can do all kinds of things. And yeah, if you want to,
where can they get it?
So Finishing Line Press is the publisher. Potter's House has a bookstore. They work with bookshop.org. If you want to support independent bookstores, which I encourage you to do, you can find it on Rocketman's website, buy it somewhere else, and go put a review on Amazon, because reviews help and spread the word. But just support poetry, support your local independent venues and magazines, and stay in touch. Be our friends. We would love to talk more with you. But Justin, tonight, I thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time, and appreciate the support and encouragement, brother. It means the world.
My absolute pleasure, man. Thank you. And it's a terrific book, Sean. Congratulations on this. Many years of work into it. It is a beautiful book. So thank you.
All right. Well, to be continued, my friend.
All right.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for checking it out. We'll see you soon.
See you.